Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Howdy.
Today we are finishing up our discussion of Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, the second book in our series Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. Today's discussion may contain spoilers. We previously posted a spoiler-free review about 2 weeks ago, which you can find in the archive. Next week, we will dive back into our love of dystopian fiction with a review of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. If you'd like to chat with us, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod.
In a previous episode, our wrap-up episode for the last series, when we were discussing the communist books, we discussed how speculative fiction serves a different purpose from realist fiction. But what happens when that genre traipses into the territory of the other? Do you think it should be excused from having to ask the same questions?
Are you asking this question because you think that alternate history novels are closer to speculative or closer to realist fiction?
I'm asking because they cross the line. And I think when they do, the questions they start to ask are different. And with a book like this one, where you're talking about not just real people, but real people that, as we've discussed, are alive today. And we're talking about not really the past, we're talking about a future as well. I think the questions it should be asking are different from how they would if this were a straight realist novel or historical novel or historical record.
I'm not sure it really matters that much to me. When I read this novel, of course, it's not telling me something that really happened, but I still think of it as realist fiction.
I feel the same way, even though I'm inclined to say that alternate history fiction is more like speculative fiction because the creation of it seems sci-fi, like it can be excused away with multiverses and such. I mean, a lot of times people just don't even bother to explain it away. They just say, here it is. That's what it is. I think when you start explaining how this can happen, this alternate history, then it gets kind of sci-fi and speculative. But in this situation, I mean, it's like almost exclusively realist. There's nothing science fiction about this book. So I never even read it thinking that it was a speculative fiction novel or even considered that it was.
Do you feel a novel like this has any obligation to be believable? Because if this is realist fiction, isn't that one of the main requirements, that it is realistic?
Yes, it does have that requirement, but it is believable in the sense that the things that happen in the novel are things that can happen. Just logically and practically, they're things that can happen. It is speculative in the sense that these are things that have not happened, but it's realistic in that everything that it shows us that can happen are things that are possible, rather than, for example, Hillary Clinton revealing that she is an secret
Lizard.
reptilian woman, yeah, a lizard woman, and like biting off Bill Clinton's head. That never happens in the novel because it makes a different kind of promise than that kind of novel would.
Which is honestly a big shame. I think I've really missed out on that opportunity.
I am certain that there are more than a handful of real person fictions where Hillary Clinton is actually a lizard or an alien or a Jewish person.
Probably, but those are all on 4chan. So, to put this another way, how much sidestepping of the very real issues, and most of those issues being things that have that people have pointed out about Hillary, how much sidestepping of those issues is permissible in a book like this? I understand that this is alternate history, so we're getting a different version of Hillary than we have in real life. But as we discussed in, I believe, in our last episode, the Hillary we get here conveniently has very little to do with all of the problems. And we can connect that back to the absence of Bill in her life, or vice versa. But that seems very convenient to saddle Bill with all of those problems.
I think this question is really interesting because, and I don't say that frequently about your questions, Sam. Um, but this question about believability, I think, is really interesting because, the question of what makes fiction believable can be answered in a whole number of ways. Like, talked about the logic of our world, but also, like, what makes fiction believable. Part of that logic is, like, the logic of plot and also how we understand human psychology and human interaction. And a big part of believability is characterization and plot. So this is kind of a different issue because we have to draw a line between, when you use the word sidestepping, for example, we have to be careful not to conflate fiction with our politics in this situation. Because a lot of times when people talk about this, or use the word sidestepping, they are talking about politicians who are dodging issues. And this is a book about politicians, and I think written by a Hillary Stan. So it's kind of like this person is approaching a book with a certain vendetta or a persuasive thesis in mind, which in a lot of cases makes for bad fiction because it can make it unbelievable when you force or shoehorn in certain beliefs. And those beliefs can make the logic of the book unbelievable. In this situation, I don't think, for me, that it crosses that line specifically, because even though it doesn't take on certain political stances that Hillary has, the essence of her as a person still seems very believable and logical. And the only part really that I thought tested the believability was the Bill aspect of the book, which is what I mentioned in a previous episode, because I thought that Bill was made to be perhaps more evil than he actually is. But even then, I mean, it's plausible that he could be a serial rapist, for example. It's just that in the real world, we don't know him as such. But if you understand this book as being purely speculative, then it's perfectly fine for him to be the serial rapist because, we are in the world of the book and not in the world of our world. So in that situation, it is believable if you're just reading the book as if it's a purely fictional work.
Sam, are you asking this question because you think it is not possible for there to be a world where there are not, serious and challenging questions that people could be asking Hillary? Is that what people should be doing? There should be some sort of confrontational question.
I'm asking because if this book's purpose is to rehabilitate, and we can argue about what the purpose of this book actually is, but if that is the purpose, to rehabilitate the image of someone, then as we discussed previously, we're existing on this very surface level with this book. And I don't know how much rehabilitation it's actually doing. So one of the issues for me is that it breaks from the Hillary we know in how it approaches race. So, for example, in the novel, Hillary's decision to run for Senate ends up snubbing Carol Moseley Brown's campaign. And this causes her to lose an important friendship in Gwen. But it also seems to be a stand in for the problems that Hillary has faced with Black voters, especially in 2016. To me, this feels like a very gross oversimplification of the issues. And I understand that this is an alternate reality where those things didn't happen as such. For example, because she was not connected to Bill, she didn't have to back the anti-crime bill that Bill championed. She didn't have to back up the super predator theory from the 90s that she latched onto, which it is connected to Bill, but I don't know how closely. We also get to avoid how her 2016 campaign largely ignored Black voters and put the burden on them to reach out to her and do the research on her themselves rather than the other way around, which is the way most campaigns work. So while I feel like her issues with Carol Moseley Brown are a stand-in for that, the book is not focused on that, even though that felt like a great opportunity for something. But all we get is this very small apology at the end, not to Brown, but to her friend Gwen, who rightfully kind of ignores it. So my question again, even if this is an alternate reality, am I unfair to demand real issues if this is supposed to be a book about rehabilitation?
I think rehabilitation, I know I used that word in the last episode. I think it's not exactly what Sittenfeld is trying to do because it's not trying to rehabilitate Hillary to everybody. I think that Sittenfeld is talking directly to people who are already fans of Hillary's, and it's more like you should feel comfortable being a Hillary fan again. You shouldn't be ashamed of supporting Hillary. I think that's what she's trying to do rather than to tell people who don't like her, you should like her.
I think this question has that kind of conflation that I was talking about. Because if you're talking about purely alternate history fiction or non realist fiction, it is always permissible to sidestep anything you want about the person you're writing about. Because there are alternate reality histories where Hitler didn't do some of the stuff he did. He always has to be evil, but he doesn't have to be evil to the same degree. Or, I mean, it's always permissible in the sense of storytelling to do it. The question is the politics or the sensibility of doing that. So, set aside non-realist alternate history fiction is like what you're saying is when you're writing about these real people or avatars of real people, do you need to present them in all of their good and bad? And I think probably no, but it makes it less interesting if you try to whitewash certain aspects of an individual, like a public individual, because you're saying that this person is less complex than he or she actually is. That makes it more boring.
I think what you're asking about here specifically with Hillary ignoring the black vote in 2016, that could have been added to the novel, but to me it seems like such a specific ask. It's not a glaringly obviously missing thing that if you made efforts to include that, it seems like it would be a totally different novel because then you would probably want to compensate by making efforts to include lots of other things that are missing. And the novel would just be very different from what it ends up being.
I guess my main issue with the novel, and we did talk about this a little bit, is that we get a fairly unflawed, not just Hillary, but unflawed character in general. And this was, to me, I feel like there are two big flaws of this character that we get. Her kind of strange desire for Bill to be what she wants Bill to be that runs throughout the book. And I get that this is like her big relationship, so it informs everything about who she is and how she sees relationships, even though she has sworn him off. It continues to play a role throughout her life. But I don't even know if we can fully call that a flaw, but that's how I saw it. The other one is how she treats Carol Moseley Brown. But again, like I said, that felt like more of a missed opportunity for that to go further, and it really didn't go anywhere. The only thing that happens from that is the fallout of a friendship.
There's that interesting question that's raised, not very interesting, honestly, but more interesting than other questions that were raised in the book, where when she wins, she calls up Carol Moseley Brown and, she tells her something about serving or whatever. And then it appears that Brown doesn't really care about serving. She's just in it for the power or prestige or who knows what. Because she says something like, we're not on camera or in public. You can dispense with the platitudes or whatever she says. Which I think is interesting because it makes it seem like Hillary does really care, which makes a certain claim that is very contrary to what a lot of people believe about her, which is that she doesn't care and she is actually just obsessed with power or whatever. And I think that's interesting because it also paints Brown as someone who's like just in it for the power or whatever it is.
I
I
read
didn't
that
read it
scene
that way.
quite different.
How
Yeah.
did you read it?
So she calls her after she wins, and she says something very kind of not patronizing, but it seems kind of like what you would tell the voters rather than a real person. You'd say, well, I'm just glad that somebody who can do a good job has the job. And then Brown's reaction is like, you don't need to talk to me like that because you're not telling me the truth. You should just level with me and be honest that you just wanted the job.
Yeah, I saw it more Not so much that Carol Moseley Brown just wants power, but I mean, she just lost a big election and she thought she was in a good spot for it. And Hillary came along and stole it. I think she's upset and she sees the race issue where Hillary at this point in the novel does not. With all of that in mind, can this novel be for anyone except for the people who already like Hillary?
It's very hard to answer a question like that because at this point, my position on most things is that people aren't reading anyways. So most people aren't reading this book, and the people who go out looking for this book already have self-selected because they want to read about Hillary. So the people who don't like Hillary aren't going to have the opportunity anyways. But if somehow they were forced to read the book, I don't think that they would be convinced because I think they would end up being like you.
I mean, I don't have a huge problem with Hillary. I gladly voted for her, but you're right that I wouldn't have picked this book up on my own. But compare this a little bit to Bill Clinton's autobiography that came out how long ago? A couple of years ago, 2, 3 years ago, something like that. Obviously, that is not realist fiction. That was supposedly a tell-all book of his time in the Oval Office. But because of the sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky in real life and in that book, there was a big to-do about that. And a lot of people were picking it up and either reading for that or just skipping ahead to find those scenes to find out, his take on what actually happened. I did not read it, but it was a big news thing. People were going crazy over this book, or at least there seemed to be a big hype around it because of that one section. We have in this book some lurid sex scenes like we talked about, but I don't think it has that pull, and I don't know that we can tie that all to the fact that it's centered on Hillary rather than it's centered on Bill. Is that fair to say?
I mean, the Lewinsky trial or the impeachment trial was such a big event that people still want to know about it. I think that's, the question, why are people more interested in Bill and sex versus Hillary and sex? I think in this instance, it's because that impeachment trial is it's like a touchstone of the 90s. I remember that, and I was a kid, right? I think that's one reason why people don't really care about Hillary and sex, besides saying it's gross or reminding them of their parents having sex or whatever.
I think one question that's worth asking is not whether or not this can be a novel for people who don't like Hillary, but rather, what about people who don't know Hillary? Because there are a lot of people outside of the American context who don't really know anything about her at all, and I think that the novel wouldn't work for them either. Because the character that we see in the novel is always drawn against a presumed layer of background knowledge. If you had somebody from China, for example, who read this who didn't know anything about Hillary Clinton, they would probably have a totally different reaction to any of us. And that's, I think, another aspect of alternate fiction or alternate history fiction that we haven't really talked about. Like, how much should it rely on the actual history and knowledge of the actual history?
Yeah, I feel like what we get is not even a mythologized version of Hillary. We get a Hillary, yes, that doesn't exist, obviously, but because there's not a whole lot of substance to this Hillary, I feel like it doesn't show any newcomer to Hillary, like you're talking about, much of anything. Like, I don't know that someone who is mostly unfamiliar with her or with real events will take much away from this, not just because this is alternate history, but because we don't really get that much about Hillary at all.
I mean, it would just be an enjoyable read. Like, it wouldn't have any ideas, really. All of the ideas come from the fact that it's alternate history. If this were someone else entirely, and it's not Hillary Clinton, just have a character, then this book would have very few in the way of ideas. So I think someone who didn't know Hillary Clinton, or let's say someone reads this 30 years from now, I think what they would pick up is just kind of like a feminist, you can do it without a man story, which is written quite well, but that's all it would be.
James, in the review episode, I believe, you talked about how one reviewer called this delectably discussable for a book club book. I'm going to ask a book club type question. I felt like Sittenfeld watched too many rom-coms. Specifically, the one that kept coming up to me was the Meryl Streep movie, It's Complicated. This felt like it took some heavy notes from that.
You are calling on some background knowledge that I don't have, so you'll have
Similar,
to explain
yeah.
that film.
I'm gonna give you a short background. Shout out to the It's Complicated fans out there.
How old is this movie? Is this recent?
It's like early 2000s, I think. It's Meryl Streep is old enough to be in this range, in the Hillary range.
But you still remember it after all these years.
Well, my sister loves this movie, so I've seen it at least a couple times with her.
Okay, good out.
Yeah. In this movie, Meryl Streep is older. She's, in her 50s or so. And it takes place mostly after she has been divorced from Alec Baldwin, her husband, who cheated on her in similar ways that Bill did, that he just can't seem to help himself. And he seems to really like to go after younger women. But she's got kids with him, so they're still connected in that way. They're friendly with each other for the most part. But she's trying to move on, and she meets a very dashing Steve Martin. And so the movie is all about how she should be focusing on Steve Martin, who seems to be perfect. But she kept getting drawn back in by Alec Baldwin, who is still, a womanizer, but suave, and with their shared history, there's a lot of baggage there. As the title says, it's complicated. One of my problems with this novel is that even though I know people do this in real life, and that Bill is supposed to be this big relationship in her life, even after rejecting him, it felt a little too rom-com-y for her to keep pinning all these hopes on Bill and keep giving him chances to redeem himself, even with knowledge that she has and secondhand knowledge that she might have. It felt a little too much like a slightly informed teenager's idea of what adulthood is.
I think it's speaking to a different sensibility. At least I'm guessing it's a different sensibility. But Sam, when people talk about somebody as being the quote, love of their life, how do you react to that idea? Is it
Oh,
ridiculous?
gross. No, I don't think it's ridiculous. But we're also talking about someone whose life has moved in a very different direction since then. It's compressed into the pages of a novel. So it makes that a much more simplified timeline. But at the same time, we're talking about decades of difference in the events of this book.
I mean, that's why they say love of my life, Sam. It's not just love of my 20s. It's like, this is the kind of relationship that sticks with you. Now, I don't really buy it myself, but I think that there are people who have a different sensibility who are like, yeah, this is a real thing. And I think those are the kinds of people who Sittenfeld is probably writing to.
So in the book, why do you think she is so drawn to the Bill of 2005? The only connection I can really draw, if it even is a connection really, is that she feels lonely, and she always had some kind of, there's an intellectual parity that excites her. Is there anything beyond that?
That's what I got as well.
I mean, it's uncomplicated, right? It seems to me like when I was reading, I was like, this is very uncomplicated.
I think you're asking for a lot. I mean, if you are especially a woman in her 50s or 60s, and you have a guy that you think is pretty handsome, and you've slept with him before, and you also think he's pretty smart, what more do you need?
I guess, I mean, not much in real life. I suppose it doesn't even have to be a woman. I mean, I don't, I don't want to say only lonely women will make this mistake or whatever. I think lonely men would probably do the same thing. It's just, in a book, you would hope for some more significance. And I I don't know if there is more significance beyond the fact that she was lonely and kind of horny. And he was someone that, was, quote, the love of her life. Like, is there anything more to that?
I count that part of the novel as one of the most realistic aspects of the novel, so I didn't have a problem with it at all. It's not honorable, it's not something you would brag about to your friends, but it does seem to be real in terms of human psychology.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the reason why I bring up this question is I think that's what makes it rom-com-y. I mean, when we think about rom-coms, what we really mean is that it is simplistic and accessible. I mean, novels can have similar plot points and premises as, Hollywood rom-coms, but what makes, literature or romantic literature is that it has more than just the plot point. Like, there are ideas behind things that are happening. I just don't think there are a lot of ideas behind this tryst. But it doesn't make it unbelievable because obviously people do often get back together and have trysts with exes and such. I mean, I've seen plenty of tweets about this as well.
Yeah, this is realistic in that sense. And I didn't have a problem with the believability of that. I guess my main issue with that is that it seemed like it was like the outcome of that dinner was expected to everyone except Hillary for some reason. Like, even just taking the bill that we know, not even taking the bill of this novel, I was not surprised. And it seemed kind of like a cheap way of just having another fight.
I was a little bit surprised because I thought if Bill was like a sex addict or whatever, he'd take it wherever he can get it. And I thought like he would just go for it, and then say, this actually doesn't mean anything, Hillary. I thought that was where the story was going. So in some ways I I don't know how I feel about it because why wouldn't he sleep with her? Like, is he suddenly loyal, or does he really strictly follow that DiCaprio rule where she has to be under a certain age? I think it's 25 for Leo.
I didn't mind it. It seems like you think, Sam, that the kind of the pathos of an older woman being sexually rejected is too cheap. But I think that
It's not cheap
I have
enough.
not I have not seen this in fiction as often as I would like, and it seemed to me like a real source of real human emotion. It's something that I had not seen elsewhere, so I didn't have a problem with it being here.
That scene, though, is one of the more interesting scenes of the book.
What makes it so for you?
Seeing Bill in his natural environment in an alternate history. Like, that's the promise. Everything else is just like, well, Hillary could have been like this anyway. It's a real life, whatever. But Bill being a tech billionaire or whatever he is, like, that's pretty interesting. And living in San Francisco.
The last point I want to bring up is how Hillary ends up clinching the nomination against Bill in 2016 by making a speech at a debate about how she resents people focusing on her likability. If you want someone attractive, you can watch a Hollywood movie, she says. Instead, she thinks people should vote for her because I'll do a good job. This felt very silly to me that this was a big turning point in her campaign, that earnestness is the way she wins the nomination. Because it seems like Sittenfeld is saying that politics shouldn't be just about likability, which is right. It shouldn't be. But to assume that she lost in real life for that reason is pretty selective memory, especially when we see nothing of her politics in this novel.
Well, in terms of people actually choosing to vote for her, she won. So that's important to me. But I think that you have to remember that this is a novel written for people who are disappointed with the Trump presidency. And this is the fan service that Sittenfeld is engaging in, where she's saying, listen, this is how the world could be, where people would say, hey, you should vote for me because I'll do a good job. And people respond to that. That's the dream for people disappointed with Trump.
Yeah, in a book about wish fulfillment, this is the most egregious example of it, I think. But that's fine. I'm okay with that.
All right.
I mean, you know what you're getting into. Like, this book is serving that purpose.
I mean, should she have won a different way, Sam?
She tried to be unethical with the whole Clinton-Trump thing.
What I wanted from a win is not a platitude, but that is maybe asking the wrong book the wrong question.
What would be a satisfying win? Her becoming more likable in some way? Like that's stretching the...
No, I think what we get is a likable person in this novel. So in the logic of the novel, that's fine.
Do you want people to ask her all of these hard questions that you've been secretly storing up, and for Hillary Clinton to actually have good answers to all of them?
Well, what I want is sure. What I want is what I've been saying all along is a book that in essence is not this book. A book that is
There's
you
a
know,
review for the dust jacket.
right. A book that does talk about real issues rather than what this book actually is answering the likability question, I think.
This book would be
This
good if it weren't this book, Sam Spieler.
Is that her... I mean, is that her memoir? I haven't read her memoir, but I'm assuming her memoir does that.
probably. And that has a much different appeal as well because it's a memoir. I guess I wanted there to be some semblance of politics, even if it's just a smattering. But everything in this novel, even the politics, are very alternate history. There's very little from reality other than a few names and a few touch points that are real. There's very few real things to latch onto here. So it ends up being, is Hillary likable? And the novel says, yes, she is likable.
Here's an alternate history kind of a question. So the premise of this is this kind of feminist premise that, she doesn't marry Bill, and Bill's kind of a jerk or a serial rapist, pick one, and her career takes off. But isn't there some kind of alternate history book where they don't get into politics or something and they just marry and end up happily ever after? Like Hillary and Bill? Like, is that less believable? I ask this question because there's a part of me that thinks, okay, people excuse Hillary because they're saying that she's just in it for the power, and she doesn't really love Bill, and that's why she's still with him even after all his infidelities. And then this book is saying, well, what if she just doesn't go along with all his infidelities? Her life would be great. But what about the opposite, where they actually really do love each other? And she actually is forgiving. It seems like no one ever says that's a possibility.
But where's the story there? And
Yeah,
also,
nobody would read that book.
Yeah, I'm not saying it should be a story. I'm saying, like, it's interesting to me that people don't think of that as a possibility. Like, I have never heard anyone say, maybe Hillary just really likes Bill. Like, maybe they really do love each other. It's always something like, well,
in
she's
real
doing it
life,
for
you
her
mean?
career. Yeah. Like, it just seems like no one even considers that aspect of it. Do you think it's like even remotely possible? I feel like it's a bit of a disservice to say that it's... I mean, this book goes in the opposite direction so hard. It is saying he's a serial rapist or he can't control himself or something. I mean, okay, maybe that's true. But yeah, I'm just wondering, like everyone goes in this direction and not the other direction where maybe they actually do like each other. And maybe he's not a serial rapist. He just has a few slip ups. Oops.
I don't think it's for sure, in my mind, that they don't really like each other. I think that the lives that they live together are so far removed from my life and pretty much everyone else's life that I have no frame of reference to evaluate what's going on. Like, who knows what's going on? It's very possible to me that they actually really do love each other.
I mean, there are people who believe, I think, that Trump and Melania actually love each other. I think there are people who believe that, right? Like, that seems like a huge stretch, right? But there seems to be at least some people who are like, oh, she's such a good wife or whatever. I mean, no one says that about Hillary. And Trump and Melania, it's a huge stretch. Like, it's I don't know which wife. They don't even seem to like talk to each other ever. They're not of the same intelligence level at all. Or maybe they are. Like, who knows? She never says anything.
What did you think about the sexual assault claim that was one of the other major points in the book? The previous intern who shaved her legs in the taxi cab?
Oh, That seemed to me just kind of a way of getting a dig at the right and seeing how the right will go for anything and how people can be paid off. But I don't know if Sittenfeld was trying to play it against the other allegations against Bill, but maybe if she were a little bit more intelligent and more politically sharp, she could have played them against each other.
Yeah, she seemed unwilling to go that route. I mean, even the Hillary seems unwilling to go that route.
Yeah, I guess the point there was just that there's these double standards for men and women, and men can do so much worse and nobody bats an eye, and women can do something totally innocuous and it gets blown out of proportion.
We'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were way off base with our reading of this book, you can let us know. We are on Reddit and on social media at CanonicalPod. You can give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. We'll be back next week with a review of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.